welcome to the New York State Museum. My name is Kat Morehouse and I'm an instructor here. On today's virtual field trip, we're back in Native Peoples Gallery here at the museum, and we're going to be talking about an important group called the Haudenosaunee. Now you guys might have heard the term Iroquois. I'll be using the word Haudenosaunee because it's how they refer to themselves, and Haudenosaunee means people of the longhouse, or people of the extending rafters. Now we know that in this region there have been people living here for thousands of years. And we know that there are still Haudenosaunee people living in this region in 2020, but we're going to be focusing on the history of the Haudenosaunee and looking back about 400 to 500 years ago. Now, make sure if you guys have any questions or any comments, you can comment right down below. We're going to have a chance for Q&A, and just let us know that you're here by giving us a wave. So, how do we know about what life was like 500 years ago? Well, lucky for us, we have a lot of evidence that we can sort through. Now, the Haudenosaunee we're living in this region, and that confederacy is made up of 6 unique nations. It's the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Tuscarora, and Seneca. So we have these 6 unique nations that were here in this region for a long time, and about 500 years ago is where we're looking, so right about the time of European settler states coming into this region, and right before. So when we're looking back at the history of the Haudenosaunee, we know that life was different. Life was different for everyone. Now, what were some ways in which life was different? Let's think. Were their houses made out of steel beams and concrete like they are today? No, they're made out of things like elm, basswood, hickory. So they're made from trees that were available around them. Were people traveling in planes and trains? No. But the Haudenosaunee did have extensive trade routes, and they had waterways that they could use for travel, so a form of travel for the Haudenosaunee 500 years ago would have been the dugout canoe. Were there grocery stores and fast food restaurants? No. But the Haudenosaunee did have a massive supply of food. They were an advanced agricultural society, which means they did lots of farming. Do you guys know any of the staple crops of the Haudenosaunee? We call them the 3 sisters. And those are corn, beans, and squash. The Haudenosaunee also were able to find food sources that were growing around them that they could gather. They were hunters that could find larger animals like deer, and they were really excellent fishers. So they were able to use those waterways that they traveled on also as a food source. Now, 500 years ago, were there hospitals and pharmacies? No. So the Haudenosaunee 500 years ago would rely on their knowledge of the human body and their knowledge of medicinal herbs that were growing around them. So they were able to use their community, what was around them, to provide everything that they need. But how do we know any of this? Well, we're really, really lucky because here we have a lot of forms of evidence that we can talk about. One of the most important forms of evidence that we have when we're looking at Haudenosaunee history is stories. The Haudenosaunee have a very rich tradition of storytelling. And those oral histories, those oral traditions are passed down from generation to generation. So we're able to learn a lot right from the Haudenosaunee community. We have some visual representations of these stories as well. This is something that is in our teaching collection, and we also have another condolence cane in our ethnology collection. And this, believe it or not, is a storytelling device. Each of these images that you see, these are called pictograms, represents one of the 50 chiefs joined the Great Law of Peace that created the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And these pegs that we see along the side, those represent the 5 original nations that joined into the Confederacy. And that's the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, the 5 original nations that joined into the Great Law of Peace. So this is used as a storytelling device. Another form of evidence we have that tells us a record of relationships, agreements, treaties, and meetings are wampum belts. Now, wampum belts are not something that you'd wear, but they're something that are used to keep a record of history for the Haudenosaunee. Now, you'll see that the wampum belts can have different symbols on them. Like this one here, we have our 2-row wampum. But something that you'll see that they have in common are the beads. We're going to see that the beads are always white and purple, and that's because they're made out of these shells here. We have our quahog shells, and right on there we see our white and our purple. They can also represent an invitation, and what I have in my hand here is called invitation wampum. So if you wanted to set a meeting with somebody, you'd use invitation wampum. So wampum is another awesome form of evidence. Now, the Haudenosaunee 500 years ago did not have a written language, but we do have some written records that we're able to use to piece together part of their history. And those are European records. We have journals and reports from French explorers like Champlain, missionaries like Sagard, but my personal favorite is a journal from 1634 that was written by a young Dutch man named Bogart. He was 22 years old when he traveled into Mohawk and Oneida territory. Now, the original journal was written in Old Dutch, and I don't speak Old Dutch, so lucky for us, groups like the New Netherland Institute partner with our museum, library, and archives to transcribe these old documents so that we can use them in classrooms today. And when Bogart is traveling in the winter of 1634, he is talking about going to these huge castles, these villages, and meeting with these important people. He's meeting with the chiefs and trying to build better trade relationships. And he talks about how well he's treated, all the food that he eats, how he's always given a warm place to sleep, and his guides that are traveling through this area with him. So it's a really cool source that we can use and piece together with some of this other information. But one of my favorite forms of evidence that we are lucky enough to have are our artifacts. And here at the New York State Museum, we have millions of artifacts that we can study. So these are found by scientists who go out and do excavations or digs and look for evidence of human history. Does anyone know what kind of scientist goes on excavations and looks for evidence of human history? Our archaeologists. And we're so lucky because here at the New York State Museum, we have an entire department of archaeologists working here to piece together the history of this region. Now, if you were doing an excavation and you were digging in the ground and looking for things from hundreds of years ago, do you think you find things that are in perfect condition, or do you think you oftentimes find broken pieces? Yeah, a lot of the times they're broken, but we can use those kind of like a puzzle to see if we can piece an artifact together, or trying to figure out the whole story of the area around you. But not everything lasts in the ground for such a long amount of time. So what our archaeologists find when they're doing these excavations are things that do hold up after a long amount of time. So we have artifacts that are made from bone, so something like an awl, a fish hook, our scraper made from a deer jaw. We also find artifacts that are made from stone. So we find projectile points, drills, fishnet sinkers, and these can help us date a site. We can learn a lot from these projectile points, things that might be like arrowheads or might have originally been connected to other things. We also find pottery, pieces of pottery or pottery sherds. Now, a cool thing that happens with these pieces of pottery, our scientists like Dr. John Hart, who works here at the New York State Museum, is able to test the inside of these pieces of pottery, and what he finds is the cooking residue. And this cooking residue that's scraped off can be tested. So we know exactly what was being cooked in this vessel, and we can learn more about the diet of Haudenosaunee villages hundreds of years ago, which I think is super awesome. Another thing that archaeologists can look at is evidence of things that are no longer there. Sounds kind of funny, right? But when they're doing excavations, they might find evidence of the longhouse. But wood, after years and years and years in the ground, starts to decompose, it starts to rot away. But it also, while it's rotting away, will stain the soil. And a post like this that would have been dug into the ground, as it decomposes, leaves a stain on the soil. And our archaeologists are able to plot that out, and that way we have the evidence of the physical construction of the longhouse, which then we're able to recreate. And what I'm standing in front of today is a recreation of a Mohawk longhouse that's right here in our gallery. Are you guys ready to head on in? All right. So outside, it's a summer's day, and our friend is up there constructing the longhouse using bark and saplings from different types of trees.
And we actually have a question in regards to that.
Yeah.
From Nicole Lefebvre, what did they use for clothing?
Clothing. So we're going to be able to see that when we step inside. Now, clothing is one of those things that we don't find a lot of archaeological evidence of, because a lot of the clothing that they were using would have been made from deer skin, fur, and that breaks down over time, right, when it's in the ground. So that's not something that we find a lot of archaeological evidence of, but we do learn about it from those European documents and those oral traditions from Haudenosaunee stories. So we're going to have a chance to go in. On the inside, we have Grandma in there, and she's telling stories, and we can see some of the clothing that they're wearing inside.
All agreed, and the boy was chosen to be the leader.
All right.
He led.
Welcome into our longhouse. And as we see, we have our benches set up. Now, they might look like bunk beds to us, but the bottom bench would be used for sleeping, and the top bench could be used for storage. And what we see are furs and baskets and food and cooking vessels, all stored within the longhouse. Now, the bench you would be sharing with your immediate family. So maybe that means your mother, your father, brothers, sisters. And across the way, you might see your aunt, your uncle, your cousins. In the next section of the longhouse, you might find grandma, grandpa, other aunts and uncles. So everybody in the longhouse was what? Family. Yep, they were all family. They were all related through the women's side. So there was a matrilineal connection. Everyone in the longhouse was also a part of the same clan. We're inside of a Mohawk longhouse, and the Mohawk have 3 clans. They have the turtle, the bear, and the wolf. Now, within a village, you would have multiple clans, multiple longhouses. You would have multiple villages within a nation, and then we have the 6 nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Now, we see here, there is a fire in the middle. These fires, you might find cooking vessels. They'd be used to heat the home. Remember that the Haudenosaunee are living in upstate, what is now upstate New York, so it can be cold, cold winters. Used to heat the home, used for cooking, used as a light source. Now, longhouses were not one particular length. They could be as short as 30 feet, as long as 400 feet. They were usually about 20 feet wide and 20 feet high. So many families could live under one roof.
We have a question from Michael Galvin. What time period is our longhouse from?
So this is about 400 years ago, roughly. But I can get you an exact date later, so don't worry. I will comment back to that after this video. Thank you for the question.
We also had a question from Ella Weller-Zembo. Why on the women's side and not the men's side? Why is it a matrilineal society?
So women were very important to the Haudenosaunee community. Women help in decision making. They help They are the clan mothers. So they kind of rule the roost when it comes to the longhouse, and they actually will appoint leaders to their community as well. So women have a very important role. And when you got married, if you were a man, you would go live in your wife's longhouse. So they kept that matrilineal society going. That's a great question, and it's an important part of their culture and their community.
We also have a question, how many people slept in one longhouse? And I know that would change depending on how long it is.
So depending on how long the longhouse is, there could be, a couple families, or there could be 20 families living under one longhouse. So there wasn't a set amount. There wasn't a quota of how many or how few people would be living in a longhouse. But that is a great question. Now there are some other resources that I'd like to point out. If you guys have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if you have questions later, I'll be checking the comments and answering below. So make sure to check back. Now, if you would like to learn more about the Haudenosaunee, we have tons of resources on our website, so make sure you check that out. And we have some wonderful YouTube videos of our archaeologists working in the collection. And we have videos from the Onondaga Nation School, which talk about things like wampum and the Thanksgiving address, which are really awesome topics. If you like stories, I suggest checking out Ganondagan's Historic State Park. They've been doing daily storytelling on their Facebook page. We also have some stories that I recommend. If you were interested in the story of the Great Law of Peace, Hiawatha and the Peacemaker is a great book that you can find online. And this is the story of how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was created and the story behind the Great Law of Peace. When you're looking at the Thanksgiving address, one that I like to use with our younger visitors is Giving Thanks, and this was written by Chief Jake Swamp. And another thing that I recommend you all doing is figuring out whose ancestral lands you spend time on. So there's an app for that, Native Land, and you can go online and figure out what native lands, ancestral lands, you're using. So here at the New York State Museum, we are on Mohawk Haudenosaunee land, and we're also on Mohican land. Any other questions that I can answer for you guys?
We do have a few questions. We had one, did the Haudenosaunee now obviously do, but did they have pets in what we're seeing here today?
That is an awesome question, and yes, they did have domesticated animals that were around them. A part of the Bogart Journal that I thought was really cool is he talks about when he's traveling into Mohawk and Oneida territories, that there were dogs that were traveling with them. And me as a pet lover, I love hanging out with my dogs, so I thought that was a really cool part of his journal. And we actually have some evidence of the early domestication of dogs in our gallery, which you can check out, and we can talk more about that later.
We also had a question about how long would it take to build a longhouse?
That's a really great question. I don't know if there would be a certain time amount that it would take to build. Obviously, the constructions are large, and you could stay in a longhouse from anywhere between 10 and 30 years. So these constructions were maintained over time. They could also be expanded. So it's not something that was constructed and then left. This was something that you would have to make continual repairs on. But that would be a really great research question.
And I also want to say that we do have other people that are answering questions on this new news feed. So thank you so much, Gwen.
Thank you. Yes, and Gwen is joining us for a virtual field trip, and she's going to be talking about contemporary Native art next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. So make sure you check her out. Her collection is phenomenal.
Excellent. And we did have a question again, that reminder for where those daily storytelling Facebook Live feeds are.
Ganondagan State Historic Park, their Facebook, and they have daily storytelling, and you can go back and listen to all the stories that they've told thus far. They're really, really phenomenal, so definitely check those out.
And I think one more question, again, we weren't able to get to everybody's questions today, but we did want a reminder, we did have this a couple times, asking what the Haudenosaunee during this time period were eating. And I know you covered that before, but maybe just a refresher.
So we know we have evidence from things like those cooking vessels and testing the cooking residue that their diet was really high in fish. It was really high in their staple crops like corn, beans, and squash. So those three sisters. You'd also find a lot eating things like deer as well. But fish and corn were two staples that there are a lot of evidence of that our scientists have been able to prove right here in this building, which I think is super awesome. Again, guys, if you have any questions that I didn't answer, or if you think of any questions, I'll be checking the comments later and getting back to you. Thank you so much for visiting, and I had a lot of fun. See you guys soon.